Somewhere it's late. Somewhere a light is still on. I like knowing that this story is finding you wherever you are tonight. Drop your city in the comments if you feel like it. And if you'd like more nights like this one, the subscribe button is how you find your way back. Now, let's begin. There is a kind of pleasure in the past that has nothing to do with heroics or glory. It lives in the small things. The smell of a fire that hasn't quite drawn right. The sound of someone shifting on a straw bed in the dark. The particular weight of a wool blanket that has never really dried out. Tonight we find our way to that past. To the Viking Age, that stretch of time running from approximately 793 to 1066 CE. When the Norse world was alive with trade and raid, with faith and famine, with extraordinary voyages and extraordinarily ordinary mornings. It is not quite what you've imagined. It rarely is. You are standing at the edge of a settlement just before dawn. The air smells of wood smoke and animals and something faintly fermented that you cannot quite place. The ground beneath your feet is cold and soft and not entirely pleasant. Somewhere nearby, a rooster is making a sound that no rooster in a children's book has ever made. It is not a dawn greeting. It is an accusation. The narrator takes over from there. The Viking Age begins, as most ages do, not with a single trumpet blast, but with a slow accumulation of circumstances. And before we travel any further into it, there is one thing worth setting aside quietly and permanently. The helmets. There were no horns. The horned helmet, that beloved symbol of Viking ferocity, was invented not by Norse craftsmen, but by costume designers working for 19th century opera productions. Specifically, the iconic image entered popular imagination through Wagner's Ring Cycle in the 1870s, nearly 1,000 years after the Viking Age had already ended. Real Viking helmets were rounded, practical affairs, often made of leather, sometimes reinforced with metal if you could afford it. And most people could not. Helmets were expensive. Think of them as the Viking equivalent of a luxury item, a status symbol that the average person in 9th century Scandinavia simply did not possess. The reality of Viking life, it turns out, was considerably less cinematic than the image we've inherited. Life in the Viking Age was less like an adventure novel and more like an extremely long camping trip. Not modern camping, with lightweight gear and insulated sleeping bags and a portable stove that folds into your pocket. The other kind. The kind where your tent is made of animal skins that still carry the faint memory of their previous owner, and your cooking fire fills your living space with smoke, because proper chimneys were still centuries away from being anyone's idea. Your home would be a longhouse, a single room shared between multiple generations of the same family, plus whatever livestock had decided the indoors suited them better that evening. The centerpiece was a fire pit that sat open in the middle of the floor. The smoke rose and found its way, eventually, through a small hole in the roof, but not before it had thoroughly watered your eyes and settled a fine layer of soot onto every surface, every garment, every face in the room. Your furniture would be rough-hewn benches and storage chests. Functional, unyielding. The kind of seating that reminds you, every single day, that ergonomic design was still a very long way off. And then there were the mornings. You wake up. Your bed is straw and animal pelts. Your spine feels, as it does every morning, as though someone with great enthusiasm and no qualifications has spent the night rearranging it. The animal skins, despite what you might charitably call their rustic warmth, are home to a small and thriving population of fleas, ticks, and various other creatures who have been quietly dining on you since you fell asleep. The itching is not imagined. It is entirely, specifically, literally real. You rise carefully, stepping over siblings, cousins, grandparents, children, and perhaps a goat or two who wandered inside during the night and found no reason to leave. Privacy, as a concept, does not really exist here. Every cough, every snore, every nocturnal sound is shared equally among everyone in the room. Personal space extends approximately 3 inches from your body, and even that becomes negotiable in the coldest weeks of winter. There is a smell. It is collective and it is considerable. A warm, close blend of last night's fermented fish, of breath that has not met anything resembling a toothbrush, of bacteria that have been cultivating happily in the humid interior of the longhouse all night. It hangs in the air the way smells do in enclosed spaces. It does not dissipate when you open the door. It follows you outside. Outside, the air is cold. Not briskly cold. Painfully, insistently cold. The kind of cold that freezes the moisture in your nostrils on the first inhale and makes your breath appear in clouds in front of your face like small, reluctant ghosts. Your approach to dental hygiene this morning involves a birch twig, which you chew in the hope of freshening a breath that has already done considerable damage to the sensibilities of anyone nearby. The twig does very little. It redistributes bacteria rather than removes them, but it is what is available, and you are not in a position to be particular. Washing your face means splashing icy water from a bucket. The water comes from the nearby stream, the same stream used for washing clothes, watering animals, and when the designated waste pit feels too far in bad weather for other purposes entirely. Water purification, such as it is, consists of hoping that whatever might harm you has settled to the bottom and stayed there. Breakfast is porridge. It is always more or less porridge. It is bland and it is grainy and it has a mysterious crunch to it that may be sand, may be a small stone from the millstone, and maybe something else entirely that you have decided not to investigate. You eat around the hard bits and focus on the calories. Salt is your entire spice cabinet. Pepper does not exist in your world. Cinnamon is worth more than most things you own. If you are fortunate this morning, there is salted fish, preserved in a manner that has made it almost unrecognizable as a creature that once swam. But protein is protein, and luxury is a relative term. Your clothing is wool. It is itchy and heavy and smells of last week's work and of the sheep it came from, because the processing was done by hand and retains the natural lanolin and the memory of the animal. The plant-based dyes that color it are not color-fast, meaning your skin carries a faint bluish or reddish tint where the fabric rubs. Fashion in the Viking Age is not about style. It is about not freezing to death, and layers are your only strategy. Your shoes, if you have them, are simple leather, offering minimal resistance to stones, thorns, and the persistent presence of animal waste along every village pathway. Many people go barefoot when the weather allows, developing calluses thick enough to have impressed a modern podiatrist. Your feet are rarely dry and rarely clean, and they are home to fungal conditions that have not yet been named, but will be your constant companions for most of your adult life. It is worth pausing here, just for a moment, on the matter of cleanliness in general. The English chroniclers of the period actually recorded complaints that Vikings were unusually hygienic, because they bathed once a week, which tells you something important about the broader state of medieval hygiene, that bathing weekly was considered excessive, almost suspicious, like a person who washes their hands before every meal. Being called a neat freak in the 9th century meant you had, at some recent point, voluntarily entered cold water. Now your day's work begins, and it is relentless in the way that only work aimed directly at survival can be. This is not the kind of labor that earns you points on a fitness tracker. It is the kind that leaves your hands calloused and your back permanently companioned by a dull ache that begins around your 25th year and never quite leaves. By the time you reach 40 in the Viking Age, you are considered almost supernaturally old. Younger members of your community observe you with a mixture of respect and mild suspicion. For men, the day might mean working the fields, chopping wood, or repairing the longhouse. Agricultural technique is, to be generous, hopeful. The basic approach is to put seed in the ground, petition the appropriate gods, and wait. Crop rotation is practiced, but the underlying chemistry of soil health is entirely unknown, meaning yields are unpredictable and often poor. A broken tool is not a minor inconvenience. It is a threat to winter survival. The stakes of every ordinary task are that high, quietly, every single day. For women, the day contains all of this and more. Cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, textile production from raw wool to finished cloth, food preservation, and often direct contribution to the farming or fishing as well. The idea of a strict division between men's work and women's work existed in principle, but survival had a way of making everyone's labor necessary regardless of category. Fishing was not leisure. It was cold, dangerous, physical work conducted in open boats on water that had no interest in anyone's well-being. Nets were hauled by hand. Storms appeared without warning. A man could be gone between one wave and the next. Hunting was not a sport. It was the desperate, focused effort to bring down a dangerous animal with primitive weapons because your family needed the meat. A boar, wounded and cornered, is not interested in the distinction between hunting and being hunted. Lunchtime brings dried meat and bread, washed down with ale. The ale is not what you would recognize by that name. It is cloudy, room temperature, and contains floating matter you have learned not to examine. It is not strong enough to intoxicate. It is strong enough to be safer than the water, which is its primary recommendation. The bread is dense and dark, and occasionally contains small fragments of stone from the millstone that ground the flour. The teeth this bread encounters are not in excellent condition. The teeth this bread encounters are going to have a difficult afternoon. The afternoon is more labor, more discomfort. The awareness, constant and unglamorous, that slacking off has consequences that are not abstract. Modern work stress involves deadlines. Viking work stress involves the simple calculation of whether what you accomplish today will be enough to survive until spring. It is a powerful motivator. It does almost nothing for what we would now call work-life balance. As the day accumulates, so do the small injuries. Blisters from tool handles. A splinter the size of a modest weapon lodged in your thumb. Mysterious scratches on your forearms from work you can no longer remember doing. The persistent ache in your lower back, which is by now an old friend. None of these receive special attention. They are simply the daily toll that existing in this body, in this time, extracts from you. Evening comes, and with it the brief mercy of the fire. This is the hour of stories. The village's best storyteller takes the warm, smoky center of the room, and the tales they tell you have heard 100 times before and you will hear 100 times again, and this does not diminish them. There is no other entertainment. There are no books unless you are wealthy or religious. There is Hnefatafl, the strategic board game something like chess, though it predates chess in Northern Europe, in which one player's king piece attempts to escape the board while the opposing pieces close in to capture him. You play it regularly. You lose it regularly, almost always to your irritatingly talented cousin. Mead and ale are passed around. This evening's variety is slightly stronger than the daytime equivalent. It burns going down and settles warmly in the stomach, and makes the recitation of everyone's family genealogy seem, if not interesting exactly, then at least endurable. Conversation turns to practical matters. Who is marrying whom? Which fields are producing well? Whether Thor has some specific grievance or is simply maintaining his general disposition toward humanity. Plans are discussed for summer raids or trading voyages. Politics is not abstract. Politics is which powerful family is currently feuding with which other powerful family, and whether you might find yourself caught between them despite your best efforts at neutrality. The fire burns lower. The light shrinks. Once the sun is down, there is no other light source, and exhaustion, the thorough physical exhaustion of a body that has worked hard since before dawn, does its quiet work. You pull your blanket close, itching and all. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a wolf howls. The sound carries across the settlement, a reminder that humans are not the only things with teeth in this world. And you sleep. Not well exactly, but completely. The rooster will not wait. So passes an ordinary day in the Viking Age. No saga was written about it. No skald composed a verse in its honor. It was simply the grinding, sustaining, relentless work of staying alive in a world that did not particularly wish to make that easy. There is something quietly humbling about it, I think. The sheer quantity of effort that ordinary life required. We remember the warriors and the voyagers, and we should. But behind every celebrated raid, behind every famous ship, there were hundreds of people who spent that same year worrying about their sheep, their soil, their stored grain, and whether the winter would be the one that finally ran out. Now the days settle into something darker, and we turn to the fragility that underlies all of it. Disease moved through Viking communities the way weather does, without announcement, without mercy, and with no particular interest in fairness. The concept of germs did not exist. Illness was attributed to imbalanced humors, to the displeasure of the gods, to evil spirits or simple bad luck. A common cold could become pneumonia. Pneumonia, without antibiotics, was frequently fatal. That cut on your hand might be packed with moldy bread, which ironically sometimes worked as a primitive form of penicillin, though no one living understood why. Or the village elder might chant over it while waving chicken bones. Both approaches were offered with equal sincerity. Infection was so common and so dangerous that the Norse had specific healing deities, among them Ire, who were continuously petitioned as wounds predictably festered. Childbirth was, by any measure, terrifying. Women giving birth would invoke Frigg and Freya, hoping for their protection, and they needed it. Maternal mortality was staggeringly high. Many women died delivering their fifth or sixth child, leaving older children motherless in a world with no social safety net beyond whatever extended family remained. The blended family, the step-parent, the household reorganized around loss, was not a modern phenomenon but a survival necessity, the continuous rearrangement of family units by death. Dental suffering was a category unto itself. Without proper care, cavities grew until the pain became unbearable. The treatments available included extraction without anesthesia, cauterization of the gum with a heated metal rod, or packing the cavity with honey, with herbs, or, in some cases, with mouse droppings. Honey has genuine antibacterial properties. Mouse droppings do not. Tooth abscesses killed people regularly, the infection spreading from jaw to skull with nothing in its path to slow it. Mental illness existed, as it always has, but it was not understood as such. A person suffering from depression might be considered weak-willed or touched by dark spirits. Psychosis or schizophrenia might mark you as cursed, or, depending on how your symptoms presented, as someone with a special connection to the divine. Treatments ranged from exile to reverence, with nothing in between that resembled actual care. The outcomes were not good either way. And then there was slavery. The Norse called enslaved people thralls. They were property. They could be bought and sold. They had no legal rights and no recourse. Thralls were often treated worse than livestock because animals were expensive to replace, and a new raid on a neighboring settlement or distant shore could produce new captives at relatively low cost. Some thralls were born into bondage, inheriting their parents' status. Others were captured in raids. Still others were people who had once been free, but were broken by debt or famine, forced to sell themselves or their children into servitude simply to survive the winter. The archaeological record is not kind on this subject. The bones of thralls show signs of malnutrition, of healed fractures consistent with physical abuse, and of lives significantly shorter than those of the free people buried nearby. Sexual exploitation of enslaved people was common and accepted. Female thralls had no right to refuse. Children born of these unions typically remained enslaved, though occasionally a master might free his own offspring. Male thralls were not exempt from abuse either, particularly those taken from distant places and regarded as novelties. Freedom was possible, in theory. Some thralls were permitted to keep a small portion of any earnings from skilled craft work, and over many years, over decades, some managed to buy their own freedom. Others were freed as a reward for extraordinary service, or by a dying master seeking to appear generous before whatever gods awaited him. But many lived their entire lives in bondage, died in it, and were buried without markers, their stories recorded only in the clinical silence of what their bones show. There is a long pause that history often takes here, before moving on to something more comfortable. I think it is worth sitting in it a moment. Religion shaped every hour of every day. The Norse pantheon was not composed of distant, benevolent figures who watched events from a comfortable remove. These were active, capricious, enormously powerful beings who took direct and specific interest in human affairs and required continuous propitiation. Your crops failed. Perhaps the sacrifice to Freya was insufficient. Your child is ill. Perhaps Frigg is displeased with your household management. An unexpected storm that destroyed 3 fishing boats. Thor's hammer at work, obviously. Religious observance was not a personal or private matter. It was a community obligation. The blot ceremonies, the great ritual sacrifices, involved the slaughter of animals and reportedly, though more rarely, of humans. The blood was collected and used to sprinkle the statues of the gods, the temple walls, and the gathered participants. The meat was then consumed in a communal meal that bound the community together through shared faith and shared protein. Participation was not optional. Luck, in the Norse world, was not random. It was a real and quasi-magical property that certain people and families possessed in greater measure than others. A leader who was lucky inspired deep loyalty, because their luck was understood to potentially extend to their followers. An unlucky person might be quietly avoided, their misfortune treated as something contagious. Omens were not dismissed. A raven landing on your rooftop might be Odin communicating something. A deformed animal birth could portend disaster for the entire settlement. Dreams were not your mind processing the day. They were messages from gods or from ancestors, and they required interpretation. The psychological weight of reading every ordinary event for supernatural significance, of existing in a world where nothing was simply accidental. It must have been genuinely exhausting. Entertainment had, as we might say, a particular flavor. The sport of Hnefatafl was something like a combination of hockey, rugby, and organized violence. The rules were minimal. The playing field was wherever there was reasonably flat ground. Broken bones, concussions, and occasional deaths were understood to be part of the activity. Disputes over outcomes could and did ignite blood feuds lasting for generations. Wrestling, called glima, was less lethal but no less serious. There were no weight classes. Smaller competitors often found themselves, to put it gently, outmatched. These were not organized events with referees and printed rule books. They were tests of strength and standing that determined your position in the community. For those less inclined toward physical competition, there was Hnefatafl, the strategic board game that predates chess in Northern Europe. One player's king piece, protected by defenders, attempted to escape the board. The opposing player's pieces worked to capture the king before he could reach safety. It was used to teach strategic thinking, and sometimes employed to resolve minor disputes without resorting to the alternative, which, given what we know about Viking dispute resolution, was probably an improvement for everyone. Skalds, the poet-musicians of the Norse world, occupied a position of genuine social importance. Their compositions were not merely entertainment. They were historical record, cultural preservation, and political instrument. A skilled skald could establish or destroy a leader's reputation across the Norse world through verses that traveled faster and farther than any army. This was a form of power that left no physical wound and was, in certain respects, more lasting. The year was punctuated by feasts and festivals that offered brief moments of abundance in lives otherwise defined by scarcity. Yule, the midwinter celebration, gathered communities together for days of eating, drinking, and reinforcing the social bonds that kept everyone alive. The spring festival of Sigablot marked the beginning of the raiding season. Harvest festivals gave thanks for whatever food had been produced and would need to sustain everyone through the winter ahead. Alcohol was central to all of these gatherings, with mead, ale, and occasionally imported wine flowing with a freedom the daily routine did not allow. Drinking was not simply recreational. It was ritualistic, with formal toasts to gods and ancestors required before the general festivities could begin. Drinking horns were passed between hands around the room, the sharing of germs as intimate and inevitable as the sharing of community. And then there were the funerals. For ordinary people, burial was simple. For chieftains and other significant figures, it was something else entirely. These were ceremonies that could last for days. There is something about ship burial that stays with you, even centuries later. Imagine the weight of it. A leader laid inside the hull of the vessel he had sailed, surrounded by objects that mattered to him in life. Animals, sometimes people. The whole arrangement either lowered into the dark earth or given to fire. These were not quiet events. They were statements of wealth, of belief, of a community's understanding of what awaited on the other side. The most macabre of Viking entertainments, though, went beyond ceremony. Public executions were not simply justice. They were spectacle, and the distinction mattered to the people who attended them. The blood eagle is perhaps the most notorious example. Described in Norse sagas in careful detail, it was said to involve severing the victim's ribs from the spine and pulling them outward, resembling wings, while the lungs were drawn through the wounds. Whether it was ever actually practiced is something scholars still debate. But the fact that it appears in multiple sagas, described with precision, tells us something regardless of whether it was real. It tells us what the Viking world found meaningful as both punishment and warning. Human sacrifice, while not an everyday occurrence, did happen. Archaeological evidence from the temple at Uppsala in Sweden suggests ritual killings took place, followed by the display of bodies in sacred groves. Whether those chosen went willingly, believing in the religious significance of what was happening to them, or whether they went against their will, is largely unknown. The sagas suggest both scenarios occurred. Probably both did. There is something worth sitting with there, in the dark. The idea that some of those people may have walked toward death believing it was the right thing to do, that the universe made sense to them in a way that required this of them. We find it difficult to reach across that distance, but they were not reaching back toward us either. They were simply inside their own world, which operated by its own logic. These darker aspects of Viking life remind us, as one way of putting it goes, that the past is a foreign country where they did things differently. What would constitute a horrifying violation of human rights to us was, to them, a normal expression of justice, religion, and even communal entertainment. The Viking worldview accepted harshness and violence as inevitable parts of existence. Not celebrated, exactly, just expected. And now, moving more gently through some of the pivotal moments that shaped the age. It is the summer of 793. You are standing on the shore of a small island off the northeast coast of England. The wind is cold even now, carrying the smell of sea grass and something faintly like smoke. There are buildings above the water. Monks move between them. And then, from the gray horizon, shapes appear that do not belong here. The raid on Lindisfarne was not just any attack on any monastery. Lindisfarne was among the most sacred sites in Anglo-Saxon England. A center of learning, of devotion, of manuscripts produced by hand over years of painstaking labor. The monks who kept it were not warriors. The treasures they held had been accumulating for generations. What the Vikings took that day was not only silver and gold. They took something harder to name, a sense of safety, a belief that certain places, consecrated to God, existed outside the reach of violence. Monks were slaughtered or drowned. Treasures were carried away. Manuscripts were destroyed or damaged beyond recovery. And the psychological impact of what happened at Lindisfarne moved outward across Europe like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Suddenly, nowhere seemed safe, not even the holiest places. The Vikings gained an immediate reputation for exceptional brutality, though in reality they were no more violent than other medieval warriors. What made them seem extraordinary was partly tactical brilliance, partly misfortune. They had chosen targets that were both wealthy and populated by people who could write. And so their reputation for savagery was recorded for posterity by the very people they had come to plunder. The monk Alcuin of York wrote, in words that still carry the weight of genuine shock, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." Chronicles of the time interpreted the raid as God's punishment for Christian sins. This was the standard theological explanation for catastrophe in the medieval period. It was easier, perhaps, to believe that God had sent this upon them than to accept that the world simply contained violence with no meaning attached to it. This raid marked the beginning of the Viking Age in Western European consciousness. Though Norse expansion had already begun in less documented regions long before Lindisfarne made it legible to history. Iceland was not quite uninhabited when the Norse arrived around 874 CE. Irish monks had established small communities there, but they left when the Vikings appeared in greater numbers. What the Norse found was a volcanic island with limited arable land, no native trees suitable for shipbuilding, and whether that could be described, generously, as challenging. And yet they stayed. The settlement of Iceland was not primarily about raiding. It was about land. Scandinavia was running out of available territory, and many of those who made the crossing were fleeing the increasing centralization of power in Norway under King Harald Fairhair. They preferred hardship with independence to comfort under growing royal authority. That is a choice that tells you something about what mattered to them. Life in Iceland was brutal by any measure. The growing season was short, the soil poor, and food shortages were frequent. Volcanic eruptions periodically destroyed what little farmland existed. Isolation meant that once the initial settlement period ended, new tools, technologies, and goods were difficult to come by. But from these conditions, the settlers developed something quietly extraordinary. A form of democratic assembly called the Althing, possibly the world's oldest parliamentary body, which met annually to settle disputes and establish laws. Greenland came next. Eric the Red discovered it around 985 CE, having been exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, which was, it should be said, a common enough reason for relocation in the Viking Age. What Eric found was a massive island that was, largely, covered in ice. He named it Greenland. The name was perhaps the first real estate scam in history, designed to attract settlers despite the reality of the terrain. Two main settlements were established on Greenland's southwestern coast, eventually housing around 3,000 people at their peak. They raised livestock, hunted seal and caribou, traded walrus ivory with Europe, built churches, and maintained their own bishop. They kept cultural and religious connections alive across an ocean. And then, over time, they did not. The last known contact with the Greenland colonies occurred in the early 15th century. What happened is pieced together from fragments. Climate change, the Little Ice Age, made conditions harder. Trade patterns shifted. Conflicts with the indigenous Inuit population grew, and perhaps simple bad luck played its part as well. When Europeans returned to Greenland centuries later, they found ruins. No survivors of the once thriving Norse colonies remained. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, went further still. Around 1000 CE, he reached the shores of North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus made his more famous voyage. The Norse called this new land Vinland, possibly referring to wild grapes or berries they found growing there. This is not legend. Archaeological evidence at Elance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, confirms the Norse presence with the remains of 8 buildings, including a forge and evidence of iron working. This was not a brief landing. It was an attempt at a more permanent presence, though it lasted only a few years at most. Why did it fail? Several things worked against it. The small number of settlers could not establish a self-sustaining colony, especially given the hostile relationships that quickly developed with the indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skraelings. The sagas describe violent encounters that made the Norse position precarious. The distance from Greenland and Iceland made regular supply difficult, and the potential benefits did not seem to justify the risks and resources a permanent settlement would have required. Unlike the European colonizers who would follow centuries later, the Vikings lacked the population pressure, the technological edge, the immunity to old-world diseases, and the political organization that would make subsequent colonization efforts succeed. Devastatingly succeed for the peoples already living there. Had Norse colonization of North America taken hold, world history might have moved in entirely different directions. Instead, knowledge of these Western lands faded into legend, preserved in the Icelandic sagas, but not shaping European exploration until centuries later. Harald Bluetooth Gormson, King of Denmark from approximately 958 to 986 CE, achieved something that was genuinely unusual in the Viking world: the political unification of a significant territory. Before Harald, Denmark was a collection of competing chieftains and petty kings. Through military conquest, strategic marriages, and political maneuvering, Harald assembled something resembling a unified Danish state. His nickname, Bluetooth, may have come from a conspicuous dead tooth that appeared blue-black, or possibly from a fondness for blueberries that stained his teeth. Either way, the name outlasted him by a considerable margin. The Bluetooth wireless standard used by modern devices is named after him, and the Bluetooth symbol itself combines the runic initials of his name. Harald's most consequential decision was his conversion to Christianity around 965 CE. The gelling stones, massive runic monuments he erected, carry the announcement of this proudly, with one stone declaring that Harald made the Danes Christian. This was not simply a private religious matter. It was a political calculation. Christian kingdoms to the south were growing more powerful, and alignment with them offered trade and alliance opportunities that a pagan king could not easily access. The conversion was not immediate or complete. Archaeological evidence shows pagan and Christian practices coexisting for generations, but it set Denmark on a path toward integration with mainstream European culture and politics. Harald also built massive ring fortresses across Denmark, perfect circles, precisely laid out, with internal streets and buildings arranged with notable regularity. These structures, known as Trelleborg-type fortresses, were significant engineering achievements. They served as administrative centers, military garrisons, and visible symbols of royal authority. What the fortresses suggest, quietly, is something worth pausing on. Despite every popular image of Vikings as wild and unorganized, they were capable of sophisticated political engineering when circumstances called for it. A people who could build perfect stone circles to project royal power were not operating on instinct alone. Harald's son, Svein Forkbeard, would continue this consolidation, eventually conquering England in 1013 and briefly uniting the two kingdoms. This set the stage for Sinuth the Great's North Sea Empire. Harald Bluetooth laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the modern Nordic states. The Christianization of the Norse world was not a single moment. It was a process spanning generations, with significant regional variations in timing and intensity. Denmark began officially converting in the mid-10th century under Harald Bluetooth. Sweden remained predominantly pagan until the 12th century, with the temple at Uppsala continuing to function as a pagan cult center long after Swedish royalty had nominally accepted the new faith. The process was not a simple replacement of one set of beliefs with another. It was something more tangled and more human than that. Christian practices and beliefs were interpreted through a Norse cultural lens. Christ was sometimes portrayed as a warrior god, not unlike Thor or Odin. Saints took on attributes of Norse deities. Saint Olaf inherited characteristics of Thor. Saint Brigid shared qualities with the goddess Brigid. The material world shows this transition clearly. Pendants featuring Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, were worn alongside Christian crosses and eventually replaced by them. Burial practices shifted gradually from cremation and ship burial with grave goods to Christian inhumation without worldly possessions. Churches were sometimes built on or near former pagan holy sites, both to claim the sacred space and to ease the transition for the people living around them. Christianity brought literacy to the Norse world. The first written records in native Scandinavian languages appeared in a Christian context. The runic alphabet, previously used for brief memorial inscriptions and magical formulas, was adapted to record longer texts, including early law codes, and eventually the sagas that preserve so much of what we know about Viking culture at all. The conversion connected Scandinavia more firmly to European political and cultural currents. Norse kings could now participate in international diplomacy on equal footing with other Christian monarchs. Trade networks expanded as religious difference no longer created barriers to commercial exchange. For ordinary Norse people, Christianity brought both costs and benefits. The new religion prohibited certain traditional practices, including polygamy and the exposure of unwanted infants, which had been common methods of managing family size and resources in a world where resources were always uncertain. Blood feuds, the traditional mechanism of social order through the threat of revenge, were gradually replaced by more centralized legal systems backed by royal power and Christian ethics. At the same time, Christianity introduced new forms of social support. The concept of charity as a religious duty was novel in the Norse context. Monasteries served as providers of medical care, education, and aid to the poor, services that had previously depended entirely on family networks. The establishment of parish churches created new community focal points and opportunities for connection beyond the boundaries of kin. By the end of the Viking Age, in the mid-11th century, Scandinavia was nominally Christian. Pagan beliefs and practices persisted in remote areas and as folk traditions, some of which continue in attenuated forms to the present day. The conversion was one of the most profound cultural transformations in European history. It turned feared raiders into participants in the mainstream of medieval civilization. Whether that was gain, or loss, or simply change, probably depends on where you were standing at the time. And now, something quieter. When we imagine Viking life, we tend to imagine the dramatic parts. The ships, the raids, the halls. What we tend to forget is the cold. Not cold as a feature of the landscape, cold as a presence. Winter in Scandinavia was not just discomfort, it was an existential challenge. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Daylight shrank to a few precious hours. Snow rendered travel impossible for months at a stretch. The Norse calendar recognized only 2 seasons, summer and winter. Winter took the larger share. Preparing for winter was a community's primary occupation during the warmer months. Hay had to be cut and dried to feed livestock through the cold. Fish and meat needed smoking or drying. Fruits and vegetables were preserved through fermentation or drying. Firewood, enormous quantities of it, had to be gathered and stored. One miscalculation, one unexpected early frost, and an entire community might be starving before spring arrived. Homes required constant maintenance. Roofs needed rethatching. Walls needed reinforcement. Any gap that allowed the bitter wind through could mean the difference between uncomfortable survival and exposure. The architecture of Viking Age homes reflected all of this. Thick walls, few windows, a central hearth that served as both cooking fire and primary source of heat. When winter finally descended, life contracted. Extended families gathered around the central hearth, sharing body heat and conserving fuel. Activities shifted indoors: weaving, carving, tool-making, and repair. Storytelling reached its peak in these dark months, with the sagas and myths serving not only as entertainment, but as cultural education and reinforcement of shared values. The stories kept something alive when almost nothing else could move. The psychological weight of the northern winter was real, even if no one had a name for it yet. Seasonal affective disorder was not a recognized condition, but winter depression certainly was a reality. The sagas occasionally reference individuals who became withdrawn, morose, or violent during the winter months, a phenomenon that modern psychiatry would recognize as consistent with severe seasonal mood disorders. Spring brought its own difficulties. As the snow melted, roads turned to mud precisely when people were most eager to move after months of confinement. Rivers swelled with meltwater, washing away bridges and drowning the unwary. Fields needed immediate attention to take advantage of the short growing season, but working waterlogged soil was backbreaking labor that often yielded poor results. Summer, that all too brief respite, brought different challenges. Insect infestations could destroy crops or spread disease. Drought could wither fields just as early frost could. Summer storms could flatten crops ready for harvest, destroying not only immediate food, but the seeds needed for the following year's planting. For coastal communities, the sea gave and the sea took. Fishing was essential for survival, but claimed lives regularly. Storms arose with little warning. Without modern weather forecasting, fishermen and traders found themselves at the mercy of waves capable of swallowing ships whole. The sagas are filled with matter-of-fact accounts of entire crews lost at sea, described with little special comment, because it was simply common enough that elaborate mourning in the prose would have been continuous. Inland forests held wolves, bears, and boar, all genuine threats. Getting lost in dense woodland could be a death sentence, particularly as winter approached. Yet those same forests provided game, timber, honey, and medicinal plants. The danger and the resource were the same place. Natural disasters struck with a frequency that modern infrastructure has largely protected us from experiencing directly. The Laki eruption in Iceland in 1783, after the Viking Age but illustrative of vulnerabilities that existed throughout it, killed 20% of Iceland's population through direct effects and the resulting famine. Similar eruptions during the Viking Age would have been understood not through geology, but as divine wrath, adding psychological terror to physical suffering. Disease arrived without warning and without explanation. Without germ theory to make sense of it or antibiotics to treat it, illness appeared as mysteriously as any supernatural curse. Epidemics moved through communities with nothing to stop them beyond isolation, which was rarely practiced systematically, and folk remedies of variable usefulness. A minor infection could progress to life-threatening sepsis with no intervention available beyond poultices, prayers, and hope. Famine was a regular presence. The marginal agricultural land of much of Scandinavia provided little buffer against crop failures. One bad summer could mean depleted stores by midwinter, and the brutal calculation that followed. Who would eat and who would not? Historical and archaeological evidence indicates that in times of severe famine, the old and the very young suffered first. Communities made the grim assessment that those most likely to survive and contribute should receive what little remained. The Norse response to all of this was a kind of pragmatic fatalism, embodied in their religious worldview. The concept of weird, or fate, the idea that certain events were predetermined and unavoidable, helped make sense of a world where human control over circumstances was minimal. When half your children died before reaching adulthood, when crops failed despite everything you had done, when sudden illness struck the strongest person you knew, belief in an ordered if harsh universe offered something. Not exactly comfort, more like a frame, something to hold the chaos inside. This fatalism was not passivity. The Norse worked with extraordinary tenacity to survive their environment, developing technologies and social structures specifically adapted to northern conditions. Their ships are perhaps the most celebrated expression of this. Flexible enough to withstand heavy seas, shallow-drafted enough to navigate rivers, light enough to be carried between waterways when necessary. These vessels transformed a geographical disadvantage, living at the cold northern edge of Europe, into a strategic advantage, providing mobility and access that more centrally located peoples lacked entirely. Norse social organization evolved to address environmental challenges too. The communal work party, where neighbors gathered to help with labor-intensive tasks like barn raising or harvest, ensured that essential work was completed. The Thing, that assembly where free men could participate in legal and political decisions, provided a mechanism for resolving disputes without resource-draining feuds and for organizing communal responses to natural disasters. Yet despite all these adaptations, the margin between survival and catastrophe remained very thin throughout the Viking Age. Modern visitors to Scandinavia, enjoying its beauty from the warmth of well-insulated hotels, touring its history in climate-controlled museums, can easily forget that this same landscape once demanded daily heroism from everyone who lived in it. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, in a temperature-controlled room, having eaten food you did not grow and wearing clothes you did not weave, it is worth considering how recently in human history such comforts would have seemed as fantastical as any tale of Valhalla. The distance between your life and the life of a Viking farmer is measured not just in years, but in something closer to a transformation of the basic conditions of existence. The family structure of the Viking world would be nearly unrecognizable by modern standards. What we might picture as a nuclear family, 2 parents and their children in a private home, bears little resemblance to the Viking Age household, which was more likely an extended unit spanning multiple generations, including not just blood relatives, but servants, thralls, and occasionally foster children from other families. This was not a social preference. It was an economic necessity. Survival required many hands. Childhood in the Viking Age was precarious from the very first days. Estimates suggest that 50% or more of children died before reaching age 5. This shaped everything about how parents related to their infants. Norse parents certainly loved their children, but they faced the brutal necessity of maintaining some emotional distance from babies who might not survive long enough to be named. Names carried weight. Children were commonly named after recently deceased relatives, believed to carry on some essence of the departed. Names often incorporated elements suggesting strength, wisdom, or divine favor. Thor, meaning thunder and the thunder god, Ulf, meaning wolf, Bjorn, meaning bear, Hilder, meaning battle, Sig, meaning victory. These elements appear frequently in compound names, embedded in children like quiet prayers that they might become something durable. Childhood ended early. By age 5 or 6, children were expected to contribute meaningfully to household labor, watching younger siblings, gathering eggs, scaring birds from fields, collecting firewood. By 12, boys were considered capable of bearing arms, and girls were expected to manage household tasks independently. Legal adulthood generally arrived around 15 or 16, though full social adulthood came with marriage and the establishment of a separate household. Education happened through apprenticeship and observation, not formal schooling. Children learned by watching and helping adults, gradually taking on more complex tasks as they demonstrated competence. Literacy was rare, generally limited to runic inscriptions used for memorials, ownership marks, and occasional messages. The rich literary culture preserved in the later sagas existed primarily as oral tradition during most of the Viking Age. Stories were memorized and recited. They lived in people, not on pages. Marriage was primarily an economic and political arrangement, negotiated between families with detailed contracts specifying bride price, meaning payment to the bride's family, dowry, meaning the assets the bride brought to the marriage, and inheritance rights. Love was considered a pleasant bonus if it developed, but not a prerequisite for a successful match. Women in Viking society had rights that would have shocked their contemporaries in much of Europe. Norse women could own property independently, initiate divorce under certain circumstances, and run businesses or farms in their husband's absence. The sagas feature formidable female characters who wielded considerable influence through both direct action and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Still, gender roles were clearly defined. Men's sphere encompassed warfare, long-distance trade, shipbuilding, metalworking, and heavy agricultural labor. Women controlled the inner realm, food preparation, textile production, dairy processing, child-rearing, and household management. Both roles were essential for survival. This created a practical interdependence that gave women more leverage than in societies where their contributions were less visibly necessary. Divorce was relatively straightforward by medieval standards. Either party could initiate it for reasons including abuse, abandonment, or failure to fulfill marital duties. Property division followed the original marriage contract, with women typically retaining their dowries and any inheritance received during the marriage. Children usually remained with the father after divorce, as they belonged to his family line, though exceptions existed. Beyond the family, Viking society was organized into a clear hierarchy, with significant regional variations. At the top stood kings and jarls or nobles. Below them came wealthy landowners, then free farmers of varying prosperity, then cottagers with small land holdings, then freedmen who had been granted or had purchased their freedom, and at the bottom, thralls or slaves who had no legal personhood. Social mobility existed, but was limited. A particularly successful farmer might rise to local prominence. A thrall might earn or be granted freedom. A warrior might accumulate wealth and status through service to a powerful lord. But the circumstances of birth largely determined one's horizon. Legal matters were decided at things, assemblies where free men gathered to resolve disputes, establish laws, and handle community governance. The most famous of these was Iceland's Althing, established around 930 CE and considered the world's oldest parliamentary institution. The Thing system represented a form of direct democracy, though one limited to free male property owners. Justice in the Viking Age relied heavily on honor and compensation rather than imprisonment or rehabilitation. Murderers typically paid wergild, literally man money, to the victim's family, rather than facing execution or confinement. The amount varied by social status. Killing a jarl cost substantially more than killing a farmer, and killing a thrall required only compensating the owner for lost property, as a thrall had no legal standing of their own. When compensation failed to satisfy, blood feuds emerged. Cycles of retaliatory killings that could continue for generations. These feuds were not lawless vendettas. They followed specific cultural rules about appropriate targets and timing. The sagas describe elaborate codes governing which family members could legitimately be killed in revenge and which were considered off-limits. Community cohesion was maintained through customs beyond the legal system. Hospitality obligations required even modest households to offer food and shelter to travelers, creating reciprocal bonds that functioned as a primitive social safety net. Feasting carried political dimensions, with attendance and seating arrangements carefully calibrated to reflect and reinforce social hierarchies. Gift-giving served as both social lubricant and subtle power play. Gifts created obligation. The recipient was expected to reciprocate with something of equal or greater value at an appropriate time. Kings and chieftains maintained loyalty through generous giving. Failure to give appropriately could trigger serious social consequences. The Old Norse term nid, roughly translated as mockery, but carrying the stronger connotation of shame, describes the social death that could result from failing to uphold gift and hospitality obligations. Social standing, in a world without courts and police in the modern sense, was not merely pleasant to have. It was structural. It held you inside the web of mutual obligation that kept you alive through the winter. This entire social system evolved to address the challenges of life in Northern Europe, balancing individual autonomy against community needs in an environment where cooperation was not optional. Modern individualism, the sense that one can simply live apart from community structures, would have been not just alien in the Viking context, but genuinely dangerous. Isolation in the northern winters meant death. And as you find yourself drifting deeper towards sleep, perhaps there is something quietly moving about that. The fundamental human need for connection and belonging has not changed across the centuries. The thread is the same thread, even if the world it runs through is almost unrecognizably different. The Vikings have developed a curious posthumous reputation for being unusually clean by medieval standards. This contains elements of both truth and exaggeration. Archaeological evidence confirms that grooming tools were common. There is something quietly contradictory about the Vikings when you sit with it long enough. A people so often reduced to horned helmets and burning monasteries, and yet, the more closely you look, the more complicated and quietly human they become. We left off somewhere in the middle of all that complexity. Let's continue. The combs survive. That's perhaps the first thing worth knowing. Among all the things that might have been lost, the combs endure, turning up in graves and settlement excavations across the Viking world. Not crude objects, either. Many are finely worked antler or bone, carved with intricate patterns, clearly valued. The kind of thing a person kept close. Alongside them in the archaeological record, tweezers, ear scoops, nail cleaners. Small instruments of personal attention that the centuries have preserved without any fuss. The Norse language itself contains a trace of this habit. The phrase laugardagur, meaning Saturday, translates literally as washing day. One day a week was set aside for bathing. By early medieval European standards, this was generous. There were monastic communities in which the rules permitted bathing only a few times per year, full stop. Though it is worth holding that bathing custom in its proper light. In winter, washing might mean nothing more than a cloth dipped in heated water and drawn quickly over the skin. In summer, it might mean wading into a lake or a stream, cool water over tired limbs, without soap, which was an expensive luxury made from ash and animal fat and not available to everyone. Cleanliness was always shaped by the conditions available to achieve it. In some of the larger Norse settlements, something closer to a communal bathhouse existed. Heated rooms where people would sweat, then scrape the skin clean with implements not entirely unlike a rough stone or primitive loofah, and then rinse. The sagas call these bathhouses. They were warm and social places, rooms where news moved from mouth to mouth and community bonds were tended alongside the body. The function was never purely hygienic. Contemporary observers from outside the Norse world occasionally noted their cleanliness, though those observations require careful reading. You are standing on the bank of the Volga River in the year 922. The water moves slowly. There is the smell of wood smoke, of livestock, of unfamiliar cooking, of the wide, flat steps stretching out behind you. A group of men are washing near the water. You watch, unsure what to think. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan stood somewhere like that, watching the Russ, those Swedish Vikings who had pressed far east along the river routes. He recorded their daily washing routine in his account. He found it disgusting. Not because they didn't wash, but because they washed in sequence, each man rinsing his face and hands in the same shared basin, coughing into it, blowing his nose into it, passing it to the next. What struck Fadlan as unclean was, by the standard of much of medieval Europe, still washing. More washing than many practiced. The English sources tell a different kind of story. Several chroniclers complained that Viking men were too appealing to English women, and the reasons given are almost endearingly mundane. They bathed weekly. They combed their hair. They changed their clothes. The monk John of Wallingford wrote it plainly. The Danes were able to seduce married women because they combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes regularly. The implication is clear, and slightly deflating for the Anglo-Saxon men in the room. The reality of Viking hygiene sits somewhere between the two caricatures that history often offers. Neither the filthy barbarian nor the unusually fastidious. A people who maintained a level of cleanliness that was practical for their lives and their technology, neither excessive nor entirely negligent. Their relative reputation for cleanliness came largely from contrast with contemporaries who bathed even less. Dental care centered on chewing sticks, typically small twigs with frayed ends, worked between the teeth. The archaeological evidence on dental health is mixed. Some Viking Age skulls show significant decay and wear. Others show surprisingly good preservation. Diet played a part. Less sugar than a modern diet, but stone-ground flour carried abrasive particles that wore enamel steadily down over years. Clothing presented its own challenge. Wool, the dominant textile, absorbed odors readily and was difficult to clean without damaging the fibers. Washing often meant beating the cloth with sticks, airing it out, rather than immersing it fully in water, which could cause shrinkage. Linen undergarments, where available, could be washed more thoroughly and acted as a barrier between skin and outer wool. Parasites were simply part of life. Analysis of soil from Viking settlements shows abundant evidence of intestinal worms, roundworm and whipworm among them. Lice and fleas were equally present. The fine-toothed delousing comb is one of the most common objects recovered from Viking Age sites. This was not a sign of exceptional uncleanliness. It was the ordinary condition of people living before modern parasiticides existed. And then there is the question of smell. In a world where everyone shared similar diets and carried similar bacterial profiles, the threshold for what registered as offensive was set quite differently than it is for us. Smoke from indoor fires permeated everything: hair, clothing, walls, food. It was simply the background note of existence, not noticed because it was everywhere. There's something quietly disorienting about that if you let yourself sit with it. Our standards of cleanliness would seem strange and excessive to a Viking. Theirs seem insufficient to us. Neither group is wrong, exactly. Both are working with what their world makes available and what their culture defines as enough. And from there, the story moves to something that has attracted far more attention than combs and washing basins: the warrior. No part of Viking culture has been more thoroughly romanticized, and perhaps more thoroughly distorted, than the idea of the Norse fighter. The popular image is vivid: berserkers in animal skins charging with supernatural fury, fearless warriors clutching legendary blades, sea raiders cutting across dark water toward undefended shores, unafraid of death because a glorious haul waited on the other side. Almost none of that holds up cleanly. Begin with the word itself. Viking, in its original usage, referred to the act of raiding, not to a people. To go Viking was to go on a raid. The vast majority of people living in Norse Scandinavia were farmers, fishers, craftspeople, and traders who never participated in a raid at all. The image of an entire society organized around combat misrepresents a world where most people spent their lives growing things and making things rather than destroying them. For those who did raid and fight, the experience was not the glorious adventure that modern storytelling tends to produce. Viking combat was brutal, chaotic, and frightening. The typical Norse fighter was not a heavily armored professional soldier. He was more likely a farmer who owned a helmet, perhaps, a wooden shield, and some padded clothing. Chainmail existed, but it was expensive and relatively rare, worn by the wealthy and the powerful. Weapons followed the same logic. The famous pattern-welded Viking sword with its decorated hilt and pommel was a significant investment, worth roughly the price of several cows. Most ordinary fighters carried spears, axes, knives, and bows, weapons that also served as tools, requiring no specialized materials to produce. The assumption that every Viking carried a magnificent sword is about as accurate as assuming every modern person drives a luxury car. The berserkers deserve their own moment, because the word has traveled so far from whatever it once described. They appear in the sagas as elite warriors devoted to Odin, fighters who entered a trance-like fury in battle, sometimes wearing the skins of bears or wolves, possessed of what the stories call supernatural strength and fearlessness. The word berserker most likely derives from bear shirt, though there is some disagreement about the etymology. What actually produced that state, if it existed, remains contested. Some scholars suggest these warriors may have used psychoactive substances, fly agaric mushrooms, bog myrtle, or alcohol to achieve their battle frenzy. Others argue the berserker state was a cultivated psychological condition reached through ritual and a kind of deliberate self-hypnosis. A third view holds that berserkers were largely literary creations, figures invented or heavily embellished to embody something terrifying about Norse warfare, rather than warriors who actually existed in the way the sagas describe. Whatever the truth, the berserker was the extreme edge of that world, not its ordinary face. The average Norse fighter was pragmatic. He preferred surprise to fair combat. He preferred to survive. He had no particular cultural compulsion to seek a glorious death when a sensible retreat was available. The idea that Vikings were uniquely fearless of death because of Valhalla requires adjustment here. Valhalla existed in Norse cosmology, yes, a great hall where some slain warriors feasted with Odin, but it was not the only afterlife destination, and it was not the expected one for most people. The majority of the dead were believed to travel to Hell's realm, a kind of underworld, not the Christian hell but a gray continuation, a place of waiting. Those who drowned were thought to be welcomed by the goddess Ran. The manner of death shaped the destination. And the sagas make it consistently clear that Norse people feared death the same way all humans fear death. They took precautions. They sought treatment for wounds. They tried, when possible, to stay alive. Dying well, facing the inevitable with composure, was valued. But that is quite different from not fearing death at all. The characterization of Vikings as uniquely bloodthirsty also needs calibration. They were capable of terrible violence. The raid on Lindisfarne and others like it demonstrate that without ambiguity. But their methods were not notably more brutal than those of their contemporaries. The Frankish king Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day at Verdun in the year 782. One day, one order, 4,500 people. That surpasses any single recorded Viking atrocity in scale. What distinguished Viking violence was not its intensity, but its targets. By attacking monasteries and churches, they violated the unwritten rules governing violence between Christian powers. Other Christian kingdoms generally treated religious sites as off-limits. The Vikings did not observe that particular boundary. The shock recorded in the chronicles was real, but it was partly the shock of a rule being broken, not simply the shock of brutality. The famous horned helmet bears mentioning once more, if only because it refuses to die quietly. It did not exist. Viking helmets were typically simple conical or rounded designs with a nose guard. Many warriors likely fought without helmets at all, as they were expensive items passed through generations. The iconic round shield with its central iron boss was real and common, but its use was more technical than a simple barrier. Viking shields were thin, around a centimeter, and designed to deflect and redirect rather than absorb. The iron boss was also an offensive weapon in close quarters. Armor, when available, consisted of layered quilted cloth, leather, or in wealthier cases mail. The full plate armor of popular Viking imagery belongs to a later century entirely. Formal combat training as later medieval society knew it did not exist. Young men learned weapon skills from older men in the family, and through games that developed relevant physical abilities. Wrestling, for instance, was both entertainment and practical preparation, building balance, leverage, and the close quarters awareness that could matter enormously when a fight came down to grabbing distance. For the majority of Norse people who occasionally participated in raids or needed to defend their homes, Fighting was a secondary skill, developed alongside farming or fishing or crafting. Only chieftains and kings could maintain dedicated fighters, the housecarls or herdmen, the household warriors who formed the professional corps around which larger forces of farmer soldiers could be gathered when need arose. The Viking warrior, held up to careful light, becomes a more human figure, a farmer who sometimes fought, a raider who preferred the advantage of surprise, a person who, like all people across all of history, feared pain and feared death and faced them when there was no other choice. That human dimension does not diminish what Norse warriors accomplished. If anything, it makes those accomplishments more real. They were not mythological creatures. They were people doing difficult things under difficult conditions, with the practical tools and imperfect courage available to any of us. Let the shape of that settle for a moment. And now, a collection of smaller stories, the details that tend to fall out of the larger histories and end up gathering dust in footnotes. They are worth retrieving. The Vikings used urine as laundry detergent. There is no gentle way to introduce that particular fact, so there it is. Urine was collected in dedicated containers and allowed to sit until its ammonia content had developed into something genuinely potent. Then the clothes went in. This aged urine, called lye, though it differs from what we know by that name today, was an effective cleaning agent. Ammonia breaks down dirt and grease. It helped set dyes in textiles. The method was sound in a chemical sense. The clothes would be soaked in the solution and worked with the feet, a form of agitation that helped the cleaning process along, and then rinsed in the nearest stream. The results were reasonably effective. The residual scent was what it was, though in a world where wood smoke permeated everything and bathing was weekly at best, the baseline for acceptable odor was simply set differently than it is now. The whole household contributed to the communal container. It was, in its own way, a collective effort. The Vikings navigated open ocean using crystals. Before compasses and long before satellites, Norse navigators crossed enormous stretches of ocean with a precision that still draws admiration from researchers. One of their tools was a crystal called Iceland spar, a form of calcite that polarizes light. On an overcast day, when the sun was hidden behind cloud, which was a common enough condition in northern latitudes, a navigator would hold the crystal up to the sky and rotate it. The polarized light patterns visible through the stone allowed the user to identify the exact position of the sun even when it could not be seen directly. Direction could then be determined with considerable accuracy. In 2013, a sunstone was found among the wreckage of an Elizabethan ship that sank in 1592, suggesting the technique remained in use well after the Viking Age had ended. Some researchers believe this navigational method may help explain how Norse voyagers reached North America centuries before Columbus, who was, it should be remembered, looking for something else entirely when he arrived in the Caribbean. Think about the first person who worked this out. Someone who picked up an unusual crystal, looked through it at the overcast sky, noticed something shift as they turned it, and followed that observation all the way to a method for crossing thousands of miles of open water in conditions that offered no obvious landmarks. That is a particular kind of attention to the world. The kind that arises when getting it wrong means dying at sea. The Vikings had formalized poetic insult contests as part of their legal proceedings. This practice was called flighting, and it was not merely theatrical. These were metrically structured verbal exchanges, elaborately crafted insult contests conducted at the Thing, the assembly where legal disputes were resolved. The two parties in a dispute would take turns delivering poetic insults, challenging each other's courage, their lineage, their sexual conduct, their personal hygiene. The assembly would judge whose verbal attack was more skillfully constructed, whose command of alliteration and kennings and mythological reference demonstrated greater intelligence and cultural mastery. A kenning, for those encountering the word quietly in the dark, is a compound metaphorical phrase. The sea called the Whale Road, blood called the sweat of the sword. Norse poetic tradition was dense with them. Winning a flighting contest could determine the outcome of a legal case based on rhetorical skill alone. The subjects of the insults would make most modern workplaces deeply uncomfortable. Accusations of cowardice, of sexual deviance, of unnatural intimacy with livestock, of dishonor in every form available to Norse imagination. These were delivered not crudely, but with poetic structure and creative flourish. Even the gods participated. In one famous mythological account, Loki exchanges escalating insults with the other deities at a feast, attacking each in turn with increasingly elaborate accusations, eventually provoking consequences that lead to his capture and punishment. Thor, not primarily known for his wit, was nonetheless capable of holding his own in a verbal contest when required. The consequences of losing a flighting were real. Beyond the legal outcome, a sufficiently devastating insult could attach itself to a person's reputation for years. In a culture where honor was considered worth more than life, that was not a small thing. The Vikings fought battles on skis. Skiing in Scandinavia predates the Viking Age by thousands of years. Rock carvings showing human figures on skis have been dated to around 5000 BCE. By the time the Norse expansion began, skis were standard winter transportation. The goddess Skadi was specifically associated with skiing and hunting, which suggests the practice was woven into the culture's understanding of itself rather than merely functional. These were not precision-engineered modern skis. They were wooden planks, often of different lengths, a longer one for gliding and a shorter one for pushing, a technique that has something in common with modern skate skiing. A single long pole, planted between the legs for braking and steering, provided control. The military applications were straightforward. In a landscape where deep winter snow could make movement nearly impossible, the ability to move quickly and quietly across that snow was a genuine strategic advantage. Warriors could appear from directions that seemed impassable, strike, and withdraw along routes that could not easily be followed. In the 13th century, after the traditional Viking Age had closed, a civil war in Norway produced one of the more striking examples of this tradition. A group of fighters known as the Birkebeiner Skide over mountain passes through a blizzard to carry the infant heir to the Norwegian throne to safety, protecting the future king from those who would have killed him. That event is commemorated today in ski marathon races held in both Norway and the United States, where participants carry a weight representing a 2-year-old child along the course. The ski warfare tradition the Vikings helped establish continued in Scandinavian military thinking for centuries. During the Finnish-Soviet Winter War of 1939 to 1940, Finnish ski troops inflicted devastating losses on far larger Soviet mechanized units, demonstrating that even in an age of tanks and aircraft, the ancient Norse practice of strapping boards to one's feet and moving silently through snow retained its military logic. Viking society included remarkably progressive legal protections for women by the standards of its time. Norse women could not speak directly at the Thing assemblies, it is true, but within that constraint, they held legal rights that would have been essentially unthinkable in much of contemporary Europe. A Norse woman could own property independently of her husband. She could inherit from both parents and from a deceased spouse. She controlled her own dowry after marriage, and she had the legal right to divorce. The grounds recognized for divorce were various: domestic violence, public insult, and, interestingly, a husband who wore clothing considered too feminine, gender expression being carefully regulated for both sexes within Norse social norms. The divorce procedure was deliberately accessible. A woman wishing to end her marriage declared her intention before witnesses at the front door of the home and then again at the couple's bed, stating her grounds each time. After that ritual, the marriage was legally dissolved. She would typically retain her dowry and any property she had brought to the union. Financial provisions ensured she was not left without resources. Children generally remained with the father's family line, though exceptions existed depending on circumstances. Women ran farms and businesses in the absence of husbands away on raids or trading expeditions. Archaeological and written evidence shows female merchants, traders, and property managers. In the sphere of religion, women held significant authority. Female practitioners of Seder, a form of Norse magic concerned with prophecy and shaping the future, were both feared and respected. The Volva, a female seer, could exercise considerable influence, with even kings seeking her counsel and treating her prophecies seriously. These protections were not perfect. Social reality did not always match legal theory, and severe limitations remained. But consider this. A Norse woman in the 10th century could legally divorce her husband for striking her and leave with half the family property. An English woman in the 19th century had virtually no legal existence independent of her husband. The direction of change, across those centuries, was not straightforwardly toward greater freedom. The erosion of women's legal standing in Norse society happened gradually, as Christianization brought European legal frameworks that treated women more explicitly as property. By the late medieval period, many of the distinctive protections once written into Scandinavian law had been diminished or removed. There is something worth sitting within that particular arc. The same culture that produced the raids on Lindisfarne and Verdun and the terror of unannounced violence along European coastlines also produced legal codes protecting women's right to leave a bad marriage and keep their property. History rarely arranges itself into the shapes we find most convenient. And then there is the blood eagle. It is one of the most vivid images attached to Viking violence in popular imagination. A ritual execution in which the ribs of a living victim were allegedly separated from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, with the lungs drawn through to complete the display. The image has appeared in television dramas, novels, and games, and has done considerable work in reinforcing the idea of Vikings as uniquely, almost aesthetically, brutal. The historical reality is genuinely uncertain, which is itself a kind of answer. The blood eagle is described in several Old Norse sagas, primarily the tales associated with Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons. But those accounts were written centuries after the events they describe, in an era when Christian writers had both motivation and precedent for embellishing stories of pagan behavior to illustrate the civilizing effect of Christianity. The saga language itself is ambiguous. The Old Norse phrase rista or an acute baki, to cut an eagle on someone's back, could be read in several ways, including as a reference to a pattern carved on the skin rather than the full anatomical procedure the later accounts describe. Some scholars have suggested that medieval writers may have misread symbolic or poetic language as literal description, translating a metaphor into a procedure that never existed. The question remains open. Serious scholars hold positions on both sides. What is clear is that the blood eagle cannot be treated as established historical fact simply because it has appeared frequently in popular media. Its prominence there tells us something about the appetite for a particular image of Viking brutality. Whether it tells us about what actually happened in the 9th century is considerably less certain. And that uncertainty, in its way, is the point. The Vikings existed. The raids existed. The long ships and the settlements and the carved combs and the crystal navigational tools and the formalized poetic insult contests and the ski troops and the women's property rights, all of it existed. The history is rich enough without requiring embellishment. It does not need the blood eagle to be more than it is, though it does need, perhaps, a willingness to hold complexity without resolving it too quickly into something simpler and more satisfying. The light outside is still dark. The hour is still late. The fjords and the longhouses and the thing assemblies are very far away, and the people who moved through them are 1,000 years gone. Their combs are in museum cases. Their crystals have been studied by optical physicists. The words of their insult contests are preserved in manuscripts that survived by luck and effort and care. They were not the heroes of the television dramas or the mindless savages of the older histories. They were people doing the work of being alive, in conditions that would be unrecognizable to us in their difficulty and unrecognizable, too, in certain moments of their beauty. That is, perhaps, enough to carry into sleep. There is a question that historians return to again and again when they consider the blood eagle, whether it actually happened at all. The anatomical reality of the blood eagle as it is commonly depicted is, to put it plainly, dubious. Separating the ribs from the spine of a living person would be extraordinarily difficult, requiring substantial anatomical knowledge and specialized tools. The victim would very likely die from shock early in the procedure, which would make the elaborate display impossible to complete on a living subject, as the sagas sometimes suggest it was performed. No archaeological evidence has ever confirmed the practice. Despite extensive excavations of Viking Age sites, no human remains show the distinctive skeletal trauma that would result from such a procedure. The absence of evidence is not, of course, the same thing as evidence of absence, but the lack of physical confirmation is, at minimum, noteworthy. What makes this especially striking is who remained silent on the subject. Contemporary accounts from the victims of Viking raids, people who had every reason to emphasize Norse cruelty, never mention anything resembling the blood eagle. Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and Irish chronicles describe Viking violence in considerable detail. They document killing, enslaving, and general pillaging. What they describe are conventional atrocities, if that word can sit beside conventional without feeling wrong. Not elaborate ritual torture. So what, then, is the most likely explanation? The blood eagle probably represents a complex tangle of mistranslation, poetic metaphor, and medieval Christian propaganda, rather than an actual historical practice. The Viking Age concept of riding an eagle on someone's back may have referred to a simpler form of ritual scarification, or a symbolic cutting, that was later exaggerated through the literary tradition. A gesture that grew, in the retelling, into something monstrous. This does not mean, of course, that Vikings were peaceful. They engaged in the standard medieval repertoire of executions. Hanging, beheading, and drowning were all practiced. They conducted human sacrifice in religious contexts, confirmed by both literary sources and archaeological evidence. They were not exceptionally humane by modern standards, but the evidence suggests they were not uniquely sadistic compared to their contemporaries either. The blood eagle myth serves as a near-perfect example of how our understanding of Viking culture has been shaped by sources far removed from the actual events, filtered through layers of cultural bias, misunderstanding, and deliberate exaggeration. The image of Norse raiders as exceptionally bloodthirsty savages served particular narrative purposes for medieval Christian writers, and it continues to capture modern imaginations precisely because it is so shockingly extreme. There is something worth sitting within that. How much of what we think we know about the past was written by someone with a reason to make it vivid? How the most lurid image is often the one that survives, while the quieter, more complicated truth dissolves into the background. The Vikings were neither noble savages nor uniquely cruel monsters, just humans operating within their cultural context, capable of both remarkable achievements and terrible violence, much like people in any era, much like people now. And so, gently we move on. You are sitting by a low fire. The room is close and warm. Across from you, someone has just placed a carved piece on a wooden board. The piece is made from walrus ivory, worn smooth where fingers have touched it many times. They look at you. They are waiting for your move. This was Hnefatafl, often called Viking chess, though it predates chess in Northern Europe by centuries, and the game being played around that fire was a serious thing. Unlike chess, with its symmetrical forces, Hnefatafl is fundamentally asymmetrical. One player controls a king piece and his defenders, attempting to reach the edges of the board, while the other commands a larger attacking force, trying to capture the king before he can escape. The tension in the game is not between equals. It is between a surrounded figure trying to break free and a ring that is trying to close. Archaeological finds reveal Hnefatafl boards ranging from simple grids scratched into wooden planks to elaborate tables with inlaid playing surfaces of bone, amber, or precious metals. Playing pieces were carved from walrus ivory, antler, bone, or stone, often with considerable artistic detail. Some high-status burials contain complete game sets, suggesting their importance as status symbols and valued possessions that should accompany the deceased into whatever came next. Beyond Hnefatafl, other games existed. Finds from the Ballindury Crannog in Ireland include a board for a game similar to Nine Men's Morris, a strategy game still played today. Dice made from bone, antler, or occasionally amber appear in numerous archaeological contexts, suggesting that games of chance ran alongside the more strategic contests, offering a different kind of uncertainty. The cultural importance of gaming extended well beyond the winter evening. The Völuspá, the Old Norse poem containing the Norse creation myth, specifically mentions the gods playing board games during their golden age, before the coming of discord and ultimately Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse. After the world's destruction and eventual rebirth, the gods find the same gaming pieces again, suggesting cosmic continuity expressed through the medium of a board game. The idea that what survives the end of everything is not a sword, not a ship, but a set of playing pieces. Skill at board games demonstrated intelligence and strategic thinking, qualities valued in potential leaders. Gaming sessions provided opportunities for social bonding, especially during the long winter months when outdoor activities were limited. They created a context for nonviolent competition and status negotiation within the community. However, Viking gaming could turn deadly serious. The sagas contain numerous accounts of arguments over games escalating into violence and even killing. The 13th century Gretti's saga describes a dispute over a board game that results in one player striking another with the Hnefatafl board itself, leading to a blood feud that claims multiple lives. Whether such literary accounts are exaggerated or not, they suggest that gaming disputes could trigger serious conflict in a culture where honor was not an abstract concept, but a matter of survival. Archaeological evidence occasionally supports these literary hints. A partial Hnefatafl board from Wimos, Denmark, shows signs of having been deliberately broken before being deposited in a bog, possibly representing a ritualized ending of a gaming board involved in some dispute or associated with a deceased owner. An object destroyed rather than discarded. There is something in that distinction. The strategic complexity of Viking board games quietly dismantles the assumption that Norse culture was primarily physical rather than intellectual. The abstract thinking required for Hnefatafl, calculating possible moves several turns ahead, understanding spatial relationships, adapting strategy to an opponent's choices, reflects sophisticated cognitive abilities that would translate directly to other domains. Trade negotiations, legal proceedings, military planning. The games were not separate from the world. They were practice for it. And now, from games played in firelight, we drift a little further, toward the question every culture has faced, and every culture has answered differently. What happens after? The popular image of the Viking afterlife tends to collapse into a single hall. Warriors die in battle, warriors go to Valhalla. But the actual Norse conception of what waited beyond death was far more intricate and far more human than that. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, was indeed one possible destination. Ruled by Odin, this martial paradise was reserved primarily for elite warriors who died in battle. These chosen warriors, called the Einherjar, would feast and fight each day in preparation for Ragnarok, when they would stand alongside the gods against the forces of chaos. It was a destination designed for a very specific kind of person, and it was never meant for everyone. In fact, only half of those slain in battle even went to Valhalla. The other half were claimed by the goddess Freya for her realm of Folkvanger, for reasons that surviving sources do not entirely explain. Even in death, the distribution of souls was divided between two powers, neither fully in command. And for most Norse people, who were farmers rather than warriors, neither of these destinations applied. The primary afterlife for ordinary people was Helheim, ruled by the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki. Despite sharing etymological roots with the Christian concept, Helheim was not a place of punishment. It was simply the default destination for those who died of illness, old age, or other nonviolent causes, what Norse sources called straw death, dying on one's bed of straw rather than in battle. Descriptions of Helheim portray it as a muted reflection of the living world, a continuation of existence, quieter and perhaps less vibrant, but not torment. Beyond these major destinations, specialized afterlives existed for particular circumstances. Those who drowned at sea were thought to be taken by the goddess Ran, who caught sailors in her net and brought them to her underwater hall. This was not necessarily viewed as a terrible fate. Ran was said to treat her guests well, though sailors naturally preferred to avoid her invitation for as long as possible. Some sources suggest different afterlife destinations based on craft or profession. The Eyjabygja saga describes a vision of a mountain opening to receive a group of recently drowned fishermen, with their deceased relatives welcoming them inside and preparing a feast. The afterlife, in this telling, is not a universal realm but something more intimate, a household, a familiar gathering. The concept of moral judgment in determining afterlife destination appears inconsistently across Norse sources. While Valhalla and Folkvanger were selective based on manner of death rather than moral virtue, some accounts suggest the existence of Nastrand, a shore of corpses, where oath-breakers, murderers, and adulterers would suffer punishment after death. This realm, featuring a hall made from serpents dripping venom on its inhabitants, bears more resemblance to punitive afterlife concepts from other religious traditions, and may reflect Christian influence on later Norse sources. Archaeological evidence offers quiet glimpses of how these beliefs shaped funeral practice. Ship burials, where the deceased was interred in an actual vessel or surrounded by symbolic stone ship settings, suggest the concept of a journey requiring transportation. The practice of including functional tools, weapons, and personal possessions indicates belief in continuity between earthly life and whatever followed. Animal sacrifices accompanying human burials may represent provisions for the journey or companions for the road. The varied nature of Viking burial practices, cremation, inhumation, ship burial, mound burial, flat-ground cemetery interment, may reflect different conceptions of the afterlife journey or regional variations in belief, or simply individual and family preference. The afterlife beliefs of the Norse world were not uniform. They shifted by region, by family, by generation. Perhaps the most quietly remarkable aspect of Norse afterlife concepts was the emphasis on remembrance by the living. The creation of rune stones commemorating the deceased, the recitation of their deeds at funerals and feasts, the maintenance of ancestral burial mounds. All of this points to a culture where being remembered was itself understood as a form of immortality. Fame never dies for the one who achieves it well, states the Hnefatafl, a collection of Old Norse wisdom poetry. Reputation among the living constituted a form of afterlife as important as any supernatural realm. The idea that you live as long as someone speaks your name. As Christianity gradually replaced Norse paganism, these complex afterlife concepts did not simply disappear. They underwent syncretism with Christian ideas. Some Viking Age grave goods show mixtures of pagan and Christian symbolism, suggesting individuals navigating the transitional period with a kind of careful hedging, honoring both possibilities at once. Certain aspects of pre-Christian funeral customs persisted well into the officially Christian era, particularly in rural areas, indicating how deep these conceptions had rooted themselves. And now, a small thing, a practical thing, something that might seem mundane beside discussions of Valhalla and fate, but which shaped the daily texture of every Viking life. How did they know what time it was? Without phones, without watches, without mechanical clocks, Vikings developed a remarkably functional timekeeping system that served their practical needs while reflecting a conception of time that feels genuinely foreign to modern experience. The Viking day was divided not into 24 equal hours, but into 8 uneven divisions called eikt, singular, or eiktir, plural. Each eikt lasted approximately 3 hours, but varied seasonally with daylight length. These divisions were identified by their relationship to the sun's position and daily activities rather than abstract numerical values. Dawn, mid-morning, midday, mid-afternoon, evening, and so forth were marked by the sun's position relative to landscape features, or by the rhythm of routine, mealtimes, work periods, the movements of a predictable day. This flexible system meant that time, as experienced, expanded and contracted with the seasons. Summer hours were longer than winter ones, reflecting the natural rhythm of daylight in northern latitudes. The extreme seasonal variation at those latitudes, ranging from nearly 24 hours of summer daylight to just a few hours in winter, made rigid equal-hour divisions impractical. Evidence suggests that certain farm buildings and settlement layouts were intentionally aligned to serve as rough sundials, with shadows falling on particular spots to indicate specific times of day. The Old Norse term heidgi, meaning high day, specifically referred to the sun's highest point, the equivalent of noon. Nighttime orientation relied primarily on star positions. The Old Norse natmal, or night clock, was likely a form of nocturnal instrument using stars rather than the sun, though the details of its operation remain speculative. Literary sources mention the ability to tell time at night by observing stellar positions, a crucial skill for navigation during the long, dark months of the northern winter. The Viking week initially consisted of just 5 days, later expanded to 7 under the influence of Roman and eventually Christian calendar systems. Each day was named after a deity or cosmic force. Tyr's Day, Tuesday, Odin's Day, Wednesday, Thor's Day, Thursday, Frigg's Day, Friday, Washing Day, Saturday, Sun's Day, Sunday, Moon's Day, Monday. This naming convention survives intact in modern English and Scandinavian day names, a quiet remnant of the Norse world woven into the ordinary language of the week. The year was divided into just 2 seasons, summer and winter, rather than 4. Summer began when the sun's shadow, cast by a specific vertical marker, reached a predetermined point, a moment celebrated with the festival of summer finding, or Sumarmal. Winter had its own official starting point, Veternadir, determined by observation rather than fixed calendar date. For longer time reckoning, Vikings used a lunisolar calendar that reconciled lunar months with the solar year through a complex system of intercalation, adding extra days or months when needed to keep the named months roughly aligned with their expected seasons. The responsibility for this adjustment fell to the lawspeaker, an official who would declare when extra days should be added to maintain seasonal alignment. What made this system particularly challenging was the absence of standardization across the Norse world. Local variations in methods for determining time created a situation where the third eikt might occur at noticeably different moments in settlements even relatively close to each other. This was not especially problematic in a society where most people never traveled far from their birthplace. but it could create genuine confusion during regional gatherings. The most quietly striking aspect of Viking timekeeping was its social dimension. The passing of time was often marked communally, through recognized activities rather than abstract measurement. Meal times, work periods, religious observances, and community gatherings provided temporal landmarks that organized daily and seasonal experience. Time was something collectively experienced and validated rather than individually measured. And this reflected a deeper cultural truth. In Norse thought, time was cyclical rather than purely linear. The yearly round of seasonal festivals, agricultural activities, and trading or raiding periods created a rhythm of recurring patterns rather than a straight progression from past to future. This cyclical conception appeared in Norse mythology as well, with the world itself moving through cycles of creation, destruction, and rebirth. The practical implications of Viking timekeeping would, it must be said, drive a modern scheduler to despair. Arranging a meeting for mid-morning might result in people arriving over a span of hours. Long-distance coordination was nearly impossible without sending messengers carrying standardized time references. Planning required flexibility and adaptability rather than rigid adherence to precise schedules. Yet despite these limitations by modern standards, the system worked remarkably well for Viking society's actual needs. Agricultural activities, religious observances, legal proceedings, and daily routines operated smoothly within this flexible framework. The system's adaptability to seasonal variation was, in the extreme northern environment, genuinely an advantage, allowing work patterns to naturally expand during the abundant summer daylight and contract during the dark winter months. Time was not something you watched, it was something you inhabited. And from time, we move to something that speaks even more directly to what it meant to live in a body in the Viking Age. Norse medical practices combined practical techniques based on generations of observed effectiveness with ritual elements that, by modern standards, would constitute something close to psychological horror. This blend of the practical and the magical created a medical system that was simultaneously more effective than many contemporary European approaches in certain ways, while being, in others, genuinely terrifying. Archaeological evidence reveals that Vikings possessed a surprisingly diverse medical toolkit. Excavations have yielded surgical instruments including knives, saws, forceps, needles, and probes, often made with considerable precision from iron, bronze, or bone. These were not crude implements, but specialized tools designed for specific medical purposes, suggesting a developed tradition of surgical intervention. The most impressive Viking medical achievement was cranial surgery. Multiple skulls from the Viking Age show evidence of trepanation, the deliberate creation of holes in the skull, with surrounding bone growth indicating that patients survived the procedure, often for years afterward. This dangerous surgery was likely performed to relieve pressure from head injuries or to treat severe headaches and seizures. The survival rate appears surprisingly high, given the absence of modern antiseptic techniques. For wound treatment, archaeological and literary evidence indicates that Vikings used honey, which has proven antibacterial properties, and certain molds that naturally produce antibiotic compounds, essentially a prehistoric version of penicillin, discovered through observation and tradition rather than laboratory science. Plant-based salves combining antimicrobial herbs with animal fats provided effective topical treatments for minor wounds and skin conditions. Linen bandages appear frequently in medical contexts, suggesting systematic wound wrapping rather than haphazard coverage. The sagas describe healers examining wounds to assess whether they penetrated body cavities, a critical diagnostic approach still relevant in modern trauma medicine. Some accounts mention probing wounds with leek stalks, which have mild antimicrobial properties, to check depth and severity. Bone setting developed into a sophisticated practice. Numerous well-healed fractures in the archaeological record indicate that Norse healers could successfully treat broken bones. Splints made from wood and bandages maintained proper alignment during healing. The sagas describe techniques for reducing dislocations that closely resemble modern methods. Where Viking medicine diverges most dramatically from modern practice is in its integration of ritual and psychological elements. Many medical procedures included invocations to specific deities associated with healing, particularly Ire, a goddess specifically connected to medical arts, but also Odin, who possessed particular knowledge of herbs and healing magic. These were not mere superstitious additions, but integral components of treatment, providing psychological comfort and possibly placebo effects that enhanced recovery. Some treatment methods cross into what we would now consider psychological torture, though they were performed with genuine healing intent. The sagas describe treatment for seizures that involved partially burying the patient in a freshly dug grave, with specific ritual foods, a deeply frightening experience designed to drive out the supernatural entities believed to cause the condition. For certain mental disturbances, treatments included exposing the patient to extreme situations intended to shock them back to normalcy. Sudden immersions in cold water, frightening encounters staged by Confederates, isolation in unfamiliar settings. Pain management relied primarily on alcohol and certain plant-derived substances with sedative properties. Henbane, mandrake, and opium poppies were known in the Viking world, though their use appears to have been limited and carefully controlled due to their dangerous side effects. Some scholars have suggested that the berserker rage reportedly experienced by certain Viking warriors may have been facilitated by deliberate consumption of mind-altering substances, possibly including Amanita muscaria mushrooms. Surgery without effective anesthesia was, of course, extraordinarily painful. The sagas sometimes describe patients biting on leather straps or wooden sticks during procedures, but largely suggest that stoic endurance of pain was expected and admired. The cultural emphasis on courage in Norse society extended fully into medical contexts, where demonstrating fortitude during painful treatments was considered honorable. Perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of Viking medicine was its integral connection to the Norse concept of weird, fate, or destiny. This created a medical mindset where intervention was always attempted, but ultimate outcomes were understood to be predetermined. Fighting against illness or injury while simultaneously accepting that the outcome might already be decided by greater forces. A paradoxical approach that never stopped trying, while remaining prepared for failure. Pregnancy and childbirth received special attention in Norse medicine. Archaeological and literary evidence suggest specialized knowledge of herbs to ease childbirth pain, reduce bleeding, and treat various gynecological conditions. The goddess Frigg was especially associated with childbirth, and elaborate ritual preparations accompanied birth to protect both mother and child from supernatural harm. The effectiveness of Viking medical practices varied dramatically. Some approaches, like honey for wound treatment, certain herbal preparations, and bone-setting techniques, had genuine therapeutic value. Others, particularly those involving magical elements, likely operated primarily through psychological mechanisms. Still others, like consuming toxic substances for certain conditions, probably caused more harm than good. The results were uneven. The intention was always, in its own terms, sincere. Imagine, for a moment, being treated for a severe headache in the Viking Age. Your head partially shaved. A skilled practitioner carefully cutting away a small section of your skull with iron tools while reciting invocations to Ire and Odin. Family members holding you still. Everyone around you expecting you to demonstrate proper Norse courage in the face of what is happening to you. Modern medical waiting times suddenly seem rather manageable. And now, the last of our wanderings tonight, not into violence or death or the mechanics of the calendar, but into something you might not have expected: beauty, or rather, the particular kind of beauty that was also, quietly, something else. The swirling, interlaced animal forms of Viking art are not simply decorative patterns. They may constitute a sophisticated visual technology designed to induce specific psychological states. The most distinctive Viking artistic style, often called the animal style or gripping beast, features interwoven animal bodies twisted into complex knots, with limbs that grasp neighboring figures. Unlike classical art traditions that prioritize clarity and symmetry, Norse art deliberately challenges visual perception through ambiguity, transformation, and optical illusion. Animals morph into other creatures. Positive and negative space reverse unexpectedly. Multiple reading paths create visual uncertainty. Archaeological evidence reveals these complex designs on everything from monumental stone carvings to personal items like combs, brooches, and sword hilts. The ubiquity of these visually complex patterns suggests they held significant cultural importance beyond decoration. Particularly elaborate examples appear on objects associated with religious or ceremonial contexts, suggesting connections to spiritual practice. The perceptual effects of viewing these designs, particularly in the flickering firelight that would have illuminated them in Viking Age settings, include mild visual disorientation and difficulty tracking individual elements through the pattern. Experimental archaeology suggests that extended contemplation of these designs, in the low-light conditions of a Viking hall, could induce mild altered states similar to meditative trance. The firelight itself would have made the animals seem to move. This disorienting quality connects to Norse religious practices involving Seder, a form of magic associated with prophecy, fate manipulation, and spiritual journeying. Literary sources describe practitioners, typically women called Valur, entering trance states to access supernatural knowledge or influence events. The visual stimulation from contemplating complex interlace patterns may have facilitated entering these altered states of consciousness. The animal motifs themselves were not randomly selected, but represented specific symbolic values and powers. Wolves and ravens connected to Odin and warrior culture. Serpents symbolizing liminal boundaries and transformation. Bears representing elite warrior status and berserker rage. The intertwining of these figures created not just aesthetic patterns, but narrative elements and power combinations, comprehensible to those versed in the symbolic language. Beyond spiritual applications, Viking art served practical psychological functions in warrior culture. The disorienting visual effects of animal interlace, decorated on shields, helmets, and sword hilts, may have been designed to momentarily confuse opponents in battle, creating split-second advantages. Experimental reconstructions suggest that shield patterns featuring certain spiral designs create optical illusions that make it difficult to judge the shield's exact distance and angle during combat movements. The psychological impact extended to political messaging as well. Leaders commissioned increasingly elaborate artwork displaying their connection to specific deities, mythological narratives, or ancestral figures. The complexity and quality of the artwork demonstrated not just wealth, but access to skilled craftspeople, a form of conspicuous consumption that reinforced social hierarchy through visual culture. What makes Viking art particularly striking from a psychological perspective is its refusal to provide visual resolution. Unlike many artistic traditions that guide the eye towards central focal points or clear narrative sequences, Norse designs frequently deny visual closure, keeping the viewer's perception in a state of constant adjustment. This perceptual ambiguity mirrors the ambiguous nature of Norse mythology itself, with its shape-shifting figures and morally complex deities. The interlace patterns also embodied philosophical concepts central to Norse worldview, particularly ideas about fate, interconnection, and the binding nature of oaths and obligations. The Old Norse term weid, roughly translating as fate but encompassing broader concepts of cause and effect through time, was conceptualized as threads connecting events and individuals across their lives. The visual representation of interweaving strands made this abstract concept tangible, present in the daily visual environment, inescapable. As Christianity gradually replaced Norse paganism, these artistic traditions underwent a fascinating transformation. Rather than simple replacement, early Christian art in Scandinavia incorporated traditional interlace patterns into crosses and biblical scenes, creating syncretic visual expressions that allowed cultural continuity while accommodating new religious content. The psychological impact of these familiar patterns likely eased the transition between religious systems. The new faith arrived, in part, wearing familiar clothing. The legacy of this visually complex tradition continues in modern Scandinavian design, transformed through centuries of evolution. The emphasis on intricate detail, natural forms, and visual complexity connects ancient runestones to modern Scandinavian artistic expressions. The psychological principles underlying Viking visual culture, the balance between order and complexity, the careful management of visual tension, remain relevant in contemporary design theory. And so we arrive at the quiet end of all of this, the blood eagle that was probably never performed, or was perhaps something far smaller and stranger than legend made it. The board games played by firelight with ivory pieces, disputes escalating into feuds over the position of a carved king. The multiple halls of the dead, each suited to a different kind of life. The flexible hours that expanded and contracted with the light. The healers who buried patients in fresh graves to drive out the spirits of seizure, and who also, quietly, discovered the antibacterial properties of honey. The art that moved on the wall when the fire moved. These were people with full inner lives, navigating a world that was cold and dark for much of the year, physically demanding in ways that are difficult to fully imagine and rich with meaning. Structured by ritual, by story, by the names they gave to each day of the week, names we still use every week without thinking. Your bedroom is warm. The temperature was set without any effort. The light will stay off because you chose it to stay off. There is hot water waiting for you in the morning, instantly, without labor. The wool blankets scratching at the eyes from smoke are not your blankets. The frost-covered outhouse is not your outhouse. The rooster that had no sense of dignity or timing is not your rooster. The Vikings faced the dark with torchlight and story, and carved ivory pieces and art that swam on the wall. They faced the unknown of death with a dozen different possible destinations, and the conviction that being remembered was itself a kind of life. You face the dark of this particular night with all of that, somehow behind you. Sleep well. Sleep well tonight. Wherever you are, whatever you're carrying, the story will still be here in the morning. Sleep well.